Vaemond Velaryon is one of the most interesting supporting characters in House of the Dragon and Fire and Blood. And although the arcs he goes through in both the book and TV series are very similar, the differences in the adaptation from page to screen, as well as the nuances that haven't been explored within House of the Dragon, give his character a great deal of depth that is really easy to miss on first viewing. Vaemond obviously fulfills the immediately established House of the Dragon tradition of being a second son who makes a lot of waves within his own family, which is an interesting switch up from his character in Fire and Blood, where he was actually Corlys Velaryon's nephew. But that relationship alteration aside, his purpose in the narrative is much the same. However, the fact that he was upgraded from nephew to brother is an intriguing change that seems to have a significant meaning that makes his position in the succession of Driftmark clearer, and thus in some ways, more dangerous. Vaemond's status as a nephew in the books rather than a brother obviously makes his claim a bit weaker, which can affect his push toward becoming Lord of the Tides in some deceptively significant ways. In a certain sense, Vaemond's attempt to stake his claim in Fire and Blood is a much bigger reach than it is in the TV series, because while he is fair to claim his place in the line of succession, he is not as directly connected to the actual Lord of Driftmark. House Velaryon is not a small family, and while Vaemond as Corlys' nephew would have a decent claim to the Driftwood throne, Corlys also had many other nephews and more distantly related family members. Clearly, being as closely related to Corlys as a brother would have cemented Vaemond's claim to Driftmark much more easily, and at least in theory, it would have been a benefit. In reality, that benefit is another matter. While Vaemond's claim as Corlys' brother would have been significantly better, that strengthened bond in House of the Dragon isn't necessarily a positive in the situation overall, because it makes him a bigger threat in Rhaenyra's attempt to usurp the Driftwood throne for Luke. Were it not so obvious that Lucerys Velaryon was not an actual Velaryon, then the issue of the succession might not be so vital. But given that Corlys' brother should so clearly inherit over Rhaenyra's illegitimate son, it makes the situation considerably more dangerous. And it's clear that Vaemond would be keenly aware of this. So the fact that it goes almost completely unacknowledged in the series is a little baffling. Vaemond's relationship to Corlys isn't the only element of the story that was adjusted in the translation from Fire and Blood to House of the Dragon, though. The most noticeable distinction aside from Vaemond and Corlys' changed relationship is the manner in which Vaemond actually dies. In House of the Dragon, the responsibility for Vaemond's murder is put mostly on Daemon, but the scene where Vaemond is killed does make it clear that both Rhaenyra and Viserys are willing to brutalize him for publicly calling out Luke as illegitimate. However, his end in Fire and Blood is significantly worse, and Daemon, Viserys, and Rhaenyra are all quite violently culpable in what is done to him in House Velaryon as a whole. The book version of Vaemond similarly argues that he should inherit Driftmark because Lucerys is illegitimate. And as a result, Rhaenyra allegedly sends Daemon to behead him and then has his corpse fed to her dragon, Syrax. And when other nephews of Corlys Velaryon similarly argued that they had a superior claim to House Velaryon as a result of Luke's illegitimacy, Viserys has their tongues cut out, and they become what is colloquially known as the Silent Five. Clearly, given the salacious narratives that are spun throughout Fire and Blood, and considering that most of this information is being chronicled from second-hand sources at best, the over-the-top nature of this brutality is at least somewhat questionable. However, what is almost certainly not questionable is that many Trueborn Velaryons were terrorized or outright killed as a result of Lucerys Velaryon not actually being a Velaryon. This is an issue that understandably became more significant as the Dance of the Dragons began, and it is an incredibly relevant aspect of Rhaenyra's characterization and progress throughout the story. Not only does it significantly impact her claim, but it makes the role of House Velaryon in her quest to the throne more baffling. And it makes her position as a future reigning leader considerably more concerning. House of the Dragon goes out of its way to water down whatever conflict exists between Rhaenyra and Corlys and Rhaenys. And as a result, it makes it seem like there are really no issues with the Velaryon succession outside of Vaemond's desire to take the Driftwood throne for himself. But that seems incredibly disingenuous and ultimately makes no sense. Because while there may be some small benefit that Corlys and Rhaenys can reap by being aligned with the Blacks, there are also some obvious dangers, and nearly every other Velaryon stands to lose a great deal due to this arrangement. So, the fact that this conflict of interest has yet to be fully acknowledged in House of the Dragon is bizarre. Many arguments have been made that the Strong Boys and their position in lines of succession for the Iron Throne and Driftmark are not an issue because essentially, the people who have power are all seemingly in agreement that this is an acceptable scenario for all involved. Jace and Luke's future inheritances should not be questioned because Viserys says so, or Corlys says so, or Laenor says so, or Rhaenyra says so. But that is a pretty willful misinterpretation of the societal structure of Westeros. And that misinterpretation clearly puts those who are not in immediate power at mortal risk. Of course, anyone who holds the title of Lord or King possesses the power that comes along with that title. But it is not a position of absolute power. And in a sense, it is power that theoretically belongs to their entire family. Corlys Velaryon may be Lord of the Tides at the moment, but that doesn't give him carte blanche to do whatever he likes with that power. Especially if whatever he likes includes giving that power away to someone who is not a Velaryon. Because of the nature of the seat that he sits on, it belongs to him so long as he has it. But there are very clear rules regulating who can take that power after he does. And while the rest of the Velaryons can't use that power while Corlys still reigns, they have a legal right to it, which is where the succession issues really begin. Corlys Velaryon was not and could not be the Lord of the Tides forever. And that is a title that legally belonged to someone else once Corlys no longer held it. By attempting to alter the line of succession to put a non-Velaryon at the front of that line, he was essentially and very likely permanently denying members of his family something that they were legally entitled to. Ergo, Vaemond's argument in House of the Dragon is ultimately a pretty fair one. It is not up to Corlys or Viserys to essentially disinherit the rest of the Velaryon family from Driftmark, simply because that's what they want to do. Despite the arguments otherwise, Viserys can't simply bestow Driftmark and House Velaryon to someone who is not a Velaryon because he wants to. Or at least, he can't do so without creating a serious and potentially deadly succession crisis. Similarly, Corlys can't just decide who will be Lord of the Tides after him. Especially if he is attempting to hand Driftmark to someone who would have no claim to it whatsoever, despite the fact that there are likely dozens of people who actually do have a legitimate claim to it. But he also shouldn't really want to hand it over to someone who isn't a Velaryon, which is one way in which House of the Dragon has really dropped the ball when it comes to its treatment of House Velaryon. Again, noble houses in Westeros obviously have a leader, typically the Lord. But the standard assumption is that the Lord will be acting in the best interests of his family and the people that he rules. And if he ever fails to do so, then it can become a problem for everyone. Clearly, something as straightforward as an open assassination is rare. But when the leader of a family begins acting out against that family's own interests, it oftentimes becomes a serious issue. And it's not outrageously unusual for their family to plot against them. And while House of the Dragon has done almost nothing to acknowledge it thus far, Corlys is essentially putting his entire blood family in mortal danger by allowing Lucerys to take the Driftwood throne because history remembers names, not blood. The TV series is far more direct about the fact that Rhaenyra's oldest children are illegitimate, which makes their positions as well as the positions of their rivals far more precarious. And because of that, Vaemond and every other Velaryon male essentially challenges Luke's inheritance and maintenance of Driftmark just by virtue of their existence. So the obvious and serious problem here is that at least theoretically, the only way to guarantee that Luke claims and keeps Driftmark for himself is by killing those who have a better claim. Meaning that all of the true-born Velaryons are put in an incredibly dangerous position as a result of the succession crisis that has been created by the Targaryens, but that is being allowed to continue by Corlys. Clearly, offing all of the Velaryons would not be a politically prudent move for the Blacks. However, the reality remains that the Velaryons are in danger by virtue of their very existence. And Vaemond's murder would undoubtedly stoke the flames of those fears by proving that they're pretty justified. Again, House of the Dragon basically completely sidesteps this issue and at least portrays the current situation as if Vaemond was the only problem. It implies that the problem was resolved by Daemon cutting Vaemond's head in half. But they have already seemingly established that the Velaryon family is not small. And while the choice to kill Vaemond was likely an intimidation tactic to show the world what happens when Jace and Luke are questioned, it would also understandably put the vast majority of House Velaryon on guard. Not only would they be keenly aware of the fact that Luke's inheritance can always be questioned as long as true-born Velaryons exist, But they would now know for a fact that Rhaenyra and Daemon had zero qualms about killing someone in their line of succession when they pushed for their own claim. So this is a clear breeding ground for serious conflict within House Velaryon itself, and Corlys's outward support for Rhaenyra should have fostered some significant problems for the Velaryons as a whole, and it really wouldn't make sense if House of the Dragon never confronts that. This also paints Vaemond's entire death scene in a fascinating light, but most of the nuances of what's actually happening there are easy to miss if you're not looking at it through the lens of this already essentially being a life or death proposition for Vaemond. He goes into the situation understandably expecting the support of the Greens, but when Viserys shows up and tells him that Lucerys will be inheriting Driftmark regardless of what Vaemond wants and regardless of actual succession law. The very obvious subtext there is that if Rhaenyra and Daemon want to ensure that Luke becomes Lord of the Tides, Vaemond will almost certainly have to be dead. And now that it's clear that he will push his claim, getting rid of him would be the only way to unequivocally nip that in the bud. Clearly, he likely wasn't expecting Daemon to cut him in half from behind like a punk in open court. But his transition from emotional to resigned to outraged makes complete sense with the context that there is a significant possibility that he'll be killed either way. Vaemond's declaration of the Strong Boy's illegitimacy in such a public setting also at least guarantees that the motivation behind his death is obvious. And although there wasn't much time to address the wider implications of Vaemond's death in the following episodes, there are a lot of politically fraught issues that need to be confronted. The show has seemingly omitted the Silent Five, which is understandable from their narrative and time limitations. But the issue regarding Vaemond's death and what it means for House Velaryon as a whole is extremely significant and will only become more vital going forward. Corlys and Rhaenys' relatively nonplussed attitude towards Vaemond's death is bizarre, and if House Velaryon is meant to credibly stand by the Blacks in the Dance of the Dragons, there really needs to be a deeper explanation as to why. It seems like Vaemond's murder was an attempt to intimidate any other potential naysayers into silence, but it has the added and obvious impact of putting those who need to be eliminated in order to ensure Rhaenyra, Jace, and Luke's inheritance on notice that their lives could be ended at any point. While Daemon's killing of Vaemond is obviously in character and is portrayed as somewhat badass, the message that it sends to Rhaenyra's rivals isn't quite as intimidating as it's meant to be. If the Blacks as a whole are willing to kill someone in the throne room in front of Westeros' most powerful people when their target doesn't even know it's coming, and if Viserys has no problem looking the other way when Daemon or Rhaenyra does something that according to most of society is beyond appalling, then that would logically put their enemies on the offense. In theory, this should push at least some of the Velaryons to attempt to act first, because if Rhaenyra or Daemon decides that they're too much of a threat, the standard rules of their governing system apparently won't apply. And while the only Velaryon who has opposed the Blacks that has gotten any character development so far is Vaemond, every one of the Velaryons, including Corlys, should at least be factoring this danger into their role in the Dance of the Dragons. The fact that a high-ranking Velaryon can be so easily and casually disposed of once he becomes an inconvenience should be a serious issue for all of the Velaryons, including the especially politically savvy Corlys and Rhaenys. Not to mention, as far as most of the world believes, this is the second time that Rhaenyra and Daemon have gotten rid of an inconvenient Velaryon heir without a second thought. The vast majority of Westeros believes that Laenor was killed in order to facilitate Rhaenyra and Daemon's union, and Rhaenyra telling Rhaenys that she super pinky promises that she didn't have Laenor killed is not a good enough explanation given the circumstances. And obviously, it's very hard not to notice the intense parallels between the Greens and the Velaryons. It's also interesting that so many viewers seem to argue that the Greens had absolutely nothing to worry about if they had just supported Rhaenyra's claim to the throne, despite the added context of Vaemond Velaryon's death. Vaemond is killed because he poses a threat to Luke's inheritance of Driftmark, and because he openly states that the Strong Boys are Strongs and not Velaryons. Aemond has already been mutilated and nearly tortured as a result of also pointing out the Strong's illegitimacy. And now they have all watched Vaemond's head get sliced in half because he dared to present his claim and state the obvious. Vaemond's murder was meant to be an object lesson on what happens to those who threaten the claims of the Blacks, and clearly the Greens learned that lesson. To presume that the incredibly politically savvy High Towers would watch a powerful person be extrajudicially slaughtered when he literally does not see it coming and not understand what danger they're all in is absurd. And to argue that they were only ever in danger because they tried to take what belonged to Rhaenyra is unbelievable. Vaemond Velaryon posed a much lesser threat to the Blacks than any of the Greens ever did. So to just take it on faith that they wouldn't be in any danger as long as they never stepped out of line for the rest of their lives is absurd. And ultimately, Vaemond's death can't work both ways. It is meant to be a threat towards those who endanger the goals of the Blacks. So to imply that no one should feel threatened by someone using an unjust killing as a direct threat is completely nonsensical. And while the impact that it has on the Greens should be obvious, it should have a much greater impact on House Velaryon. And as of yet, it hasn't. Again, in fairness, it's not like House of the Dragon even had time to address this at the end of the first season. But it is a vitally important element of the political storyline going forward. And it would be incredibly unfortunate if it goes unexplored and unacknowledged. If the unjust execution of Ned Stark is enough to start a civil war, then the notion that House Velaryon would simply let go of Vaemond's death and work tirelessly and truthfully towards Rhaenyra's ascension to the throne is legitimately unbelievable. But what do you think? Is Vaemond Velaryon's death misunderstood? And will his killing have a broader impact on House of the Dragon in the future? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.